They'd been unleashed to wreak havoc on the North Atlantic. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the newest and fastest battlecruisers in the German fleet, were spoiling for a real fight. A Royal Navy cruiser, perhaps, or even a battleship. So when the lookout cried, "Ship sighted," anticipation crackled through the air. But the shape that emerged from the November mist was wrong. Too tall, too soft-lined. It was a passenger liner. Someone had bolted a few antique 6-inch guns to its decks. She was almost cute. Admiral Marschall could have erased the vessel from the sea with a single salvo from his 1811-inch guns, but there was no honor in that. Instead, a German searchlight blinked a merciful command. "Heave to, or we fire. Surrender." The crew in the Scharnhorst watched, waiting for the inevitable white flag. Any second now. Instead, a flash of orange erupted from the liner's bow. A shell screamed past the bridge, a gesture of impossible defiance. The liner, HMS Rawalpindi, was going to war. HMS Rawalpindi began life with white linen tablecloths and promenade decks, not shell hoists and ready-use lockers. Launched in 1925 for the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, the 16,697-ton liner ran the Britain-India route until August 1939, when the Admiralty requisitioned her and rushed through a conversion that put 8 elderly 6-inch guns and 2 3-inch anti-aircraft mounts on an unarmored hull. The result was an armed merchant cruiser, or AMC, in name and in spirit, but still a passenger ship at heart. She was commissioned on September 19, 1939, with a crew drawn heavily from reservists and merchant seamen, and with a captain who embodied the old service. Edward Coverley Kennedy, age 60, recalled from retirement, brought a lifetime at sea and a sense of duty that would soon be tested in the harshest way possible. Her long lines and the new gun positions never altered what lay beneath. Speed around 17 knots, no armor, and guns with Great War lineage. The Northern Patrol became her beat, a cold and lonely stretch between Iceland, the Faroes, and Scotland, where AMCs and cruisers watched for raiders slipping toward the Atlantic trade lanes. Her job was to warn the Allies of such incursion. AMCs were stopgaps. They were slower than modern heavy units, they lacked fire control, and their thin skins could not stand up to anything larger than a destroyer. Orders were clear. If a patrol ship sighted a German cruiser or a pocket battleship, she was to shadow and signal, not stand and fight. Even so, in the fearful autumn of 1939, something was better than nothing. The Admiralty needed hulls at sea to widen the blockade and to force enemy raiders to reveal themselves. That was the logic that sent Rawalpindi north in October. She proved useful at once, stopping neutrals for inspection and reporting a scuttled German tanker in the Denmark Strait. Her detailed reports cut both ways, though. The signal could also betray a ship's presence to German codebreakers who were already listening. Most of her men were reservists, merchant sailors turned gun crew, stokers who had last seen action in 1918, young seamen with barely a month of gunnery training. Between inspections of neutral ships, they chipped ice, repaired frozen fittings, and tried to keep spirits up with talk of home. Evenings brought the brief comfort of cocoa and cigarettes in the wardroom. Captain Kennedy kept a quiet ship, insisting on proper naval routine and dress even in the cold. He told his officers that discipline was what separated a warship from a floating target. In November, the North Atlantic was iron cold. Spray froze to railings, daylight was brief, and fog banks grew like walls. Into that haze sailed a peacetime liner in wartime paint. While Rawalpindi patrolled her icy watchline, the Kriegsmarine moved. Deutschland had raided earlier in the autumn, before mechanical trouble drove her home. Graf Spee was already loose in the South Atlantic. To cover the withdrawal north and to threaten British trade, Berlin sent its newest pair, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 26,000-ton sisters with 9 11-inch guns apiece and speed over 30 knots. Their actual displacement was closer to 32,100 standard tons, making them formidable opponents for any ship afloat. Their orders from Grand Admiral Eric Raeder were explicit: force a reaction from the British home fleet to relieve pressure on the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee operating in the South Atlantic, and destroy any detached British patrol forces encountered. For months, The two ships had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine. They represented the rebirth of German sea power after 2 decades of treaty shackles. Sleek, fast, and built for North Atlantic endurance, they were designed to hunt commerce and outrun pursuit. On paper, they were not battleships, but Panzerschiffe, a hybrid new class that could chase down anything weaker and evade anything stronger. Their mission was as much political as it was naval. Hitler wanted proof that his new navy could strike fear into British shipping lanes. Admiral Raeder's surface fleet, still tiny compared to the Royal Navy, needed a victory at a time when U-boats had not yet stolen the war's headlines. A successful sortie would show Germany could still challenge Britain's sea empire. The men aboard Scharnhorst knew it too. They were out to test their new ship and their own nerve against whatever the North Atlantic threw their way. Vice Admiral Wilhelm Marschall sailed from Wilhelmshaven on November 21, 1939, with light cruiser and destroyer screens that peeled away once foul weather hid the heavy units. The plan was to push through the Iceland-Faroes Gap, appear to threaten the Atlantic shipping routes, and force the Royal Navy to shift weight. They knew Britain's patrol line was thin and patchy. They also knew that weather and speed favored a quick thrust and a quicker disappearance. Rawalpindi's 3rd Patrol put her roughly where the German plot line converged with British practice. She'd already broadcast once in October after finding the tanker Gunzenheim, scuttled rather than taken, a signal that almost certainly reached German naval command. She had also stopped neutral traffic. On November 23rd, the conditions were textbook North Atlantic winter. The sun clung to the horizon in the early afternoon. Fog formed on the port bow. Icebergs drifted past like pale cliffs. Visibility fell and rose in strips as twilight advanced. The Northern Patrol had purpose, yet it also had a weakness that the Germans meant to exploit. These makeshift cruisers could not run with a battlecruiser, and they could not fight one for more than a few minutes. Around 3:30 p.m. on November 23rd, southeast of Iceland, and roughly between that island and the Faroes, the lookout on Rawalpindi's forward crow's nest sang out. 2 shapes, masts and superstructures on the horizon. The sea was calm but freezing. Fog hung to port. Icebergs slid past, white and spectral. Captain Kennedy took his glasses and studied the silhouettes. He thought of Deutschland at first, the very radar they'd been warned to avoid. He did not hesitate on the essentials. Action stations. Report contact. The wireless operator tapped out the message that mattered most. An enemy sighting with position. Then came Kennedy's answer, quote, "Enemy vessel sighted. Am engaging." That signal went to the Admiralty and to uninvited ears. German interception service B Dienst was listening and could read positions almost in real time. One sentence told London to move heavy forces. That same sentence told Marshall where his presence had been detected. Kennedy tried to use the sea. He turned hard to port, toward the fog bank, and ordered smoke floats thrown overboard. Black smoke poured from the funnel as the engineers leaned on the boilers. The floats failed in the cold. The fog was a shifting wall that did not quite take them in. Kennedy swung back to starboard, aiming to hide behind a large iceberg 4 miles away. Even a liner could use a berg like a headland in such light. He needed minutes and miles. The ships on the horizon had other ideas. They closed at speed, faster than any merchantman, and they cut off the path to concealment. A hard point of light blinked on the horizon. A German searchlight spelled, quote, "Heave 2, stop sending." A warning shot fell ahead, a tall white column of water that left no doubt. The men in Rawalpindi wondered for an instant if a friendly cruiser had mistaken them, a hope that faded as soon as a midshipman reported what his eyes actually saw. Not one threat, but 2. Not Deutschland alone, but a pair of modern battlecruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, running together, and now on either hand. Kennedy stood on his bridge with a ship that could neither flee nor hide. He had a duty to preserve his crew and to report and resist when resistance could gain time. He refused the order. He would keep the transmitter going, clear the decks, and prepare to fire. Kennedy looked to his chief engineer and spoke with a calm and decisive tone that looked almost alien coming from a frail old man, quote, "We'll fight them both. They'll sink us, and that'll be that. Goodbye." He shook the engineer's hand and ordered the decks cleared for action. Despite not complying with the surrender signal, the German ships waited, giving this vastly inferior ship a chance to come to her senses and submit, to save the lives of everyone on board in the face of certain annihilation. At about 3:45 p.m., Rawalpindi fired. The old 6-inchers barked in maximum range. Against a modern, director-controlled main battery, it should have been symbolic only. Yet the first salvo found its mark. Shells burst against Scharnhorst's hull in a spectacular show of defiance. One 6-inch hit struck home, causing splinter damage. The shell exploded against Scharnhorst's quarterdeck, severing a signal lamp and wounding a single German sailor. It was a pinprick to a giant, and a shock to German officers who had offered the chance to surrender twice. Reports suggest that even Gneisenau felt near misses. On Scharnhorst, Captain Kurt Hoffmann could hardly credit the audacity. He had signaled to save lives, and here was this civilian boat with a few guns strapped to it, trying to fight a pair of the most advanced warships in the world. Admiration and inevitability clashed in the gunnery tower. The tiny specks of flame from the liner's guns looked absurdly small against the horizon, like sparks from a match against the steel-gray sea. But those sparks were coming closer, and when one of them burst against Scharnhorst's plating, the shock rippled through the bridge. Officers muttered in disbelief. Captain Hoffmann hesitated before ordering return fire. It was one thing to destroy an enemy ship, another to obliterate a relic of peacetime filled with reservists and civilians. Some on the bridge even argued for holding fire, to give the British ship another chance to strike her colors. The Admiral's signal ended the debate. War had no patience for sentiment. It would be a brief engagement, but hopefully one that would serve as an example to other Allied vessels. The mismatch was stark. The two German ships together mounted 18 11-inch guns, a total overkill when just one of them could tear open the old liner's armorless hull. The range was closed to around 4 miles, a knife range for a battlecruiser. The opening German salvo straddled and then smashed. Heavy shells slammed into the boat deck and bridge. The wireless cabin was wrecked, cutting the ship off from further signals. Kennedy lived through the first hammer blow. Fire licked along the decks and into the superstructure. The power went out. Central control was gone. Ammunition parties became human chains, carrying 6-inch shells by hand from magazines, while others worked to flood compartments to keep cordite from cooking off. Petty officers hauled open valves below to drown an aft magazine. 3 11-inch shells struck the liner amidships, destroying the bridge, wrecking the main wireless office, and cutting all power to the gunnery control systems. Above, Chief Petty Officer Humphreys led local control and kept the remaining guns firing independently. What had begun as a signal to London had become a simple act of will. They would keep the guns alive and the fire contained. They would keep shooting at a ship that outranged and outgunned them by orders of magnitude. More importantly, they would keep the enemy fixed in place while the North Atlantic watched. Gneisenau came up on the other side and added her storm of steel. Rawalpindi was caught in a murderous crossfire. A cluster of 11-inch shells obliterated the main director and forward control. Guns fell silent one by one as mounts were smashed. Still, the ship fired. A gunner recalled getting 3 rounds off, while shells struck home again and again. Another survivor saw a lone gunner loading and firing his 6-inch single-handed after his crew had been wiped out. When his weapon jammed and he turned for help, every man around him was gone. The lights failed. Steam and smoke filled the compartments. In the engine spaces and stoke holds, men worked until there was nothing left to work with. The scene was grim. A liner listing, aflame from stem to stern, still throwing flashes from isolated guns, while 2 great gray shapes hammered her to pieces. Scenes on deck were close to apocalyptic. Cordite cases and shells had to be thrown overboard to keep them from igniting. Kennedy moved along the decks, coordinating what could be coordinated, with no communications and far too few hands. He even tried to rig smoke aft to buy a last sliver of concealment. By about 4 p.m., Rawalpindi had been beaten to a standstill. She was blazing along her length. The captain's luck ran out near the aft decks, where he was taken by a shell burst while organizing the abandonment. The order to abandon ship was passed by word of mouth. Then the magazines made their own announcement. An 11-inch shell reached a forward magazine that had not yet been flooded. The detonation broke the ship in two. Debris and flame leapt skyward. One gun fired a final errant shot into the air as if in reflex, and then fell silent. The fight had lasted no more than a quarter of an hour from first shot to destruction. The effect, operationally, was already accomplished. A sighting report was sent. A pair of German capital ships held and engaged long enough to bring British units rushing to the quadrant. Tactically, it was carnage. Strategically, it was costly for the Germans in a way that did not show on their casualty sheets. The veil had been torn away. The breakout had been identified, and the home fleet was moving. Fire drove men over the side. Lifeboats were swung out and overloaded. One boat, with roughly 40 wounded and shell-shocked men, capsized on lowering, dumping its human cargo straight into the North Atlantic. Survival in such water is measured in minutes. Small groups clawed for anything that would float. One account tells of 4 men clinging to an overturned lifeboat, 3 slipping away, one flattening himself against the curved hull as his strength faded and the cold shattered his grip. When rescuers found him later, he was frozen to the boat and had to be pried loose. Scharnhorst circled in for the coup de grace and then ceased fire. Old customs still had force at sea. With the enemy defeated and burning, Captain Hoffman slowed and prepared to render aid. Searchlights probed the black water as night fell and the wind raised a spray. British survivors hurled curses. German voices called jokes about the cold and promises of hot tea across the water. In one swamp boat were about 10 men, including leading seaman Royston Ledbetter, still in shock. He was a gunner who had dragged his wounded brother toward the boats amid the wreckage, fighting the cold, the fires, and the oil-slicked waters until his body began to fail. He lost him in the chaos. He reached a half-submerged boat with a few others. The Germans trained a light on them and beckoned. They tried to pull closer with 3 oars as the sea raged around them. At that instant, the reason Rawalpindi had fought announced itself again. Lookouts on the German ships saw a new contact. A British cruiser was racing to the position. HMS Newcastle had answered the call. She sighted Gneisenau in the dark and even fired at long range. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, unwilling to be pinned down and smashed by British reinforcements, broke off the rescue. One of the Germans called across the cold to the survivors waiting to be pulled up to safety, quote, "Sorry, we cannot stop. One of your ships is near. Good night and good luck." The heavy engines wound up. Their wake nearly swamped the huddled men they were leaving behind. It was a cruel moment that was not at the Germans' choosing. The rescue that had begun as chivalry had to yield to survival. British help arrived once the enemy had cleared away. HMS Chitral, another AMC that had waited prudently out of sight, crept in to search. She found Ledbetter's boat with 10 survivors. She found others. In all, British ships picked up 11 men from the water. The Germans had taken off more before withdrawing. Early British press reports guessed 25 to 30 had been rescued by the enemy. Later sources settled on 37, men like Scottish gunner Robert McBay, who would spend the war as prisoners. Out of roughly 276 to 300 aboard Rawalpindi, about 238 were lost with the ship, and about 48 lived. Rawalpindi's signals set fleets in motion. Believing at first that Deutschland was the contact, Admiral Forbes threw a wide net. Battleships Nelson and Rodney, battlecruiser Hood, and multiple cruisers and destroyers fanned out to cut off an imagined dash toward the Norwegian Sea. The German heavy units were not where the British had expected them to be. They were where Rawalpindi had seen them, already turning for home in a rising squall. Newcastle and Delhi had them for a time, but darkness and weather favored the fugitives. Without airborne radar, and with winter night closing, the Royal Navy lost them. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau reached Germany intact, their sortie aborted. That result is the strategic heart of the story. Rawalpindi was lost in a devastating clash that many argue should have been avoided. What he did accomplish was summarized by leading seaman Ledbetter, who would later say it plainly, quote, "Their sacrifice turned the raiders back." Back home, the story quickly gained widespread attention. Newspapers ran survivors' accounts within days. 10 men, in hastily issued uniforms, stood at Horse Guards Parade to hear Admiral Sir Charles Little tell them that they had upheld the traditions of the Navy. On the street, People cheered them without prompting. This was late November 1939. The phony war on land felt like waiting for the hammer to fall. The sea war felt very real. A converted liner standing to, reporting contact, firing first, and dying hard, gave the country a symbol of resolve that would push Britain forward in the dark days ahead, when it would face its darkest hour. Kennedy did not receive a Victoria Cross. The criteria was strict, and it was early in the war. He received a mention in dispatches. History gave him another kind of recognition. His farewell on the bridge became a line repeated in memoirs and narratives, a statement of character more than bravado. In every retelling, you can hear the quiet certainty of a man who had measured the odds and still chose to fight. The Royal Navy found a use for such stories. All of Britain did. Within weeks, orders went out, tightening the Northern Patrol Line, and aircraft began supplementing surface watches around Iceland. In Germany, the incident was handled carefully. The Kriegsmarine press releases praised Kennedy's courage, even as they celebrated the victory. Within naval circles, there was a quiet embarrassment at how long it had taken 2 modern battlecruisers to silence a converted liner. In Britain, the event took on a different life. Films, newsreels, and recruiting posters invoked the name Rawalpindi as proof that the old naval spirit was still alive. The wreck of HMS Rawalpindi lies at 63 degrees 40 minutes north and 12 degrees 31 minutes west, a designated war grave in the deep North Atlantic water. 238 men went down with her, including her captain. The attack resonated immediately back in Britain, a nation hungry for heroes during the phony war. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, reported the loss to Parliament, declaring that Captain Kennedy's decision to fight against impossible odds upheld, quote, the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. The ship's saga transcended mere footnote status. Her end also foreshadowed the greater struggle that lay ahead. For the Kriegsmarine, the sortie was a tactical success, but a strategic failure. Sinking the AMC cost them valuable time and the element of surprise, forcing Admiral Marschall to abort the planned Atlantic raid and return to Germany under threat from the entire British home fleet. The primary mission, to relieve pressure on the Admiral Graf Spee, had failed. In the immediate aftermath, the Admiralty was forced to reassess the profound vulnerability of armed merchant cruisers. Orders were reinforced that these ships were scouts, not combatants, and their role was strictly to, quote, report and retire. To prevent a repeat of the disaster, the Northern Patrol was soon augmented by heavy cruisers and increased air patrols from the Orkney Islands. Rawalpindi's stand was the first chapter in the vast, unending fight for the North Atlantic, a battle where merchant sailors, escort crews, and converted liners would stand between Britain and starvation. Kennedy's son, Ludovic, who was a naval officer himself and served on destroyers during the war, later carried his father's name into public life as a renowned writer and broadcaster. In his memoirs, he often returned to the story of the Rawalpindi, reflecting on the stark duty that led his father to a decision that was both magnificent and, in his view, militarily unnecessary.